Welcome to Civil War Digital Digest. I'm Will. Well, we're back for the first time in a couple of years in Kilbourne City, Wisconsin, as we know it during the Civil War. Today we call it the Wisconsin Dells, and we're with Dave Rambow, wet plate photographer here. Dave, within Kilbourne City, where are we right now?
The building we're in is the original studio that was purpose-built as a portrait studio for Mr. Henry Hamilton Bennett in 1875.
Great. And how does this change? I mean, we're in 1875. We do an 1860s web series. If I'm a Civil War soldier looking to have my image struck before heading to war, how much does this change from then?
Okay, the 1860s, especially the early years of the war, if you have images of that time, the surroundings are really Spartan. It's a blank white wall or maybe very subtle backdrop, unless you happen to go to Benton Barracks, Missouri, and then you have this standard backdrop. The floors sometimes were bare boards, but as time went on and people got more used to photography, of course, everything got more ostentatious and dressed up. And by the time this era ended, the Victorian times, you'd have tree trunks and grass and lion hides and all kinds of things laying around. So it got really crazy.
Fantastic. Well, what was it like? Talk to me about what the experience today is, coming into a studio and having an image made.
Okay. First of all, it wasn't something you did usually spur of the moment. You would come in and you probably make an appointment with the operator, as oftentimes the photographer was called. You do that usually in the front of the building. They would give you certain instructions on what to wear, if you're going to be wearing makeup, what shades to use or not to use, and give you a ballpark figure on the price and how long you'd have to stand or stand still. So if you had a small child or an animal like a dog or a cat, you'd kind of know what you're up against.
Well, standing still. Why do we stand still for a photograph in the Civil War era?
Okay. The film, if you can call it film, was either on a metal plate or a glass plate. Chemicals were poured onto that to make it light sensitive. And the ASA or film speed of that piece at that time was about 1 to 1.5. Not 100, but 1. So very slow film.
Okay, so what does that mean in real terms? Today we've got this wonderful light wall that comes from the era and we're using the sky as our light. How long am I looking at standing for an image?
Depending on how long the photographer wants to torture you. Actually, with a light like this, if I have the lens wide open, like I'm planning to do today, we're hoping, again, it's always different, but we're hoping about 10 to 15 seconds.
Always different. What changes?
Everything changes. Your humidity, the light source, the clouds, the time of year. So the photographer of that time had to be aware of all these things. You couldn't just turn on an incandescent light. That wouldn't work. You'd have to work with the sun.
What's the price point? What are we looking at in a studio in the Civil War era?
Prices varied quite a bit. For a small CDV-sized tintype, you might be paying 10 cents a quarter for one piece. Oftentimes your camera had the capability to shoot 4 or 6 or 8 at a time, and you might get a discount if you'd order multiples like that, and they could just be cut apart with tin snips and mounted separately.
Gotcha. And what's the backing? What's the metal actually for a tintype?
Traditionally, they weren't tin, they were steel.
Where do we get the name tintype?
Tin, one, was cheap. This was a cheap type of photography, so it was tinny, it was cheap. Another, you use tin snips to separate those pieces, and somebody may have seen that happen and assumed those were tin because of the snips.
Talk to me about the concept of having your image taken during the Civil War. We're so used to pulling a phone out of our pocket and it has a camera in it. I think I took probably a dozen photos at work yesterday just because.
Right.
Totally different mindset.
Today, as we all know, we're bombarded with imagery. Print ads, movies, movie ads, your driver's license, everything has an image attached to it. And no matter what we do, fun or embarrassing, somebody's recording that. In the Civil War, it wasn't that way. You went to a specific place, maybe you'd never had your image made before, and so you didn't know what it was going to be like, but you always wanted to put what they said, your best face forward. And so you wanted to look very austere, very composed, very perfect to show to the world or your family. And so there was none of this silly smiling or giggling or goofing around. As time went on in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, you start seeing a change in photography where people in the tintypes even were having fun. But this early time, it was really important to be very austere and very composed looking.
Okay. Well, we'll use tintype today. Talk to me about you as a photographer, what you have to go through to get the tintype ready, and then what's the process? And how much of it will I see as a patron?
Oh, luckily, most people never see what the problems we go through. It's horrible. You go into the dark room, which is sometimes in the back of the studio. First, you take out a plate. You make sure it's really clean. There's no dust or marks on it. You pour a solution that smells like heaven. It's called collodion. And the reason it smells like heaven, one of the main components is ether. So if you stand in that room too long, you might become lightheaded. But luckily, we're not going to do that today. After the collodion has settled a little bit, you take that plate and you dip it in a vat of what we call silver nitrate. In the early days of photography, they had a much more poetic name. They called it lunar caustic. And it sets in the dark room, in that lunar caustic or silver nitrate for about 3 minutes. And during that time, the silver nitrate connects with that collodion, which acts like a substrate, and it kind of glues it all together onto that plate. Without the collodion, the silver would just slough off. You wouldn't get an actual, light sensitive plate. After 3 minutes, you come back out, you put your plate first in a light tight container. They called these sometimes a slate, because it was about the size and shape of a slate. Inside that, it's like a little clam hinged thing. You keep the negative in the dark, even though you're coming out here into the light, until you pull a certain slide out when that's already in the camera. The next step is the really important one, is the actual exposure. The subject or subjects have to maintain perfect straightness, or if they're sitting down, be motionless. 2 things we always tell our victims, we call them, is you can blink and breathe as normal, because your eye movement is so fast that this slow film won't pick up a rapid blink. Other than that, you should stay still.
If I turn my head, what happens?
Any demonstrative movement of your hands, head, legs, or any other part would register as a blur. Now, by today's standards, when you're making art photography, yeah, those blurs are kind of cool sometimes, and they're kind of sexy sometimes. You can do ghosts and things by moving the head. But in the time of the Civil War, most of the time, this wasn't for fun. This was serious stuff, so you wanted to make your plate look perfect with as few flaws in it as possible.
Well, I spoke with collector Dale Neeson, and he gave us permission to use a CDV that is unidentified out of his collection with a Michigan backmark, and I've tailored my impression for the day around that CDV so that we can go ahead and we'll use tin here. But if you want to get that ready, I'll pull the extra pieces together, and let's see how we do replicating that image.
Keep my fingers crossed.
There we go.
Fantastic.
We'll be back in just a minute here. Well, we're back and we're across the room, and I've added some layers, and I hear the photographer is about to come out. So I've had a couple of assistants posing me. So what's the weird science we have there, Dave?
Okay, this is the slate or the dark slide that the actual film is in, the one plate. And every time you take a photo, you have to do this over and over. So you can't take multiple shots. This is the one. We have the camera pre-focused on you. There's a viewing screen in the back, much as you'd use on a smartphone. you can see what you're going to be taking an image of. So what I have to do, unfortunately, there's no electronics involved with this. So I flip that out of the way and insert this dark slide the exact distance that viewing screen was. The next step is to slide this out, which exposes the camera film to the front of the lens. And I hate to do this to you, but we're going to increase the amount of seconds to 20.
Okay.
So how you feeling about that?
Pretty good. So it's time, right?
Whenever you're ready, let me know.
Let's make an image.
Okay, here we go. We're making an image. 20, 19, 18, 17, 16, 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and clear.
I've never been so aware of my blinking in my life.
Isn't that the truth? And on this end of the camera, it seems like nothing. But when you're standing there,
Wow.
20, 30, 40 seconds, your mind starts to wander even sometimes. Or maybe that's just me.
Well, we're back, and Dave's been back in the wizard's room again. That's people wouldn't see in the photographic process. What's happened back there?
A lot. Actually, the image, we could not see it on the film until this developer was poured on it. Then it came up kind of as a blue, kind of an aqua blue. You can see an image, but it's faint, and it looks as a negative. To make that pull out, after I've washed the developer off, we pour this magic elixir called Fixer on there. And this is where the magic really happens, and I'm really happy that we're able to bring this out for our customers to see this. Usually, this was not done in front of the public, though. So just for the reveal, we like to do that today. I've done this thousands and thousands of times, and it's a little moment of magic whenever this happens.
I remember back when we shot a short film together, you came out and did wet plate for us, and we're in 90-degree heat in the middle of the woods, and you hand me this container, and we see what we're about to see here.
So fingers crossed that it will work.
All right.
So here we go. Just pour this on. This could also be done in a tray, in a dipper, but we're just doing it in a tray.
When you say a dipper, it would be in and you dip the picture in?
Dip the picture in the...
Wow, look at that.
And here we come. Wow. One thing I've always noticed about doing these images, oftentimes we are told the age of a soldier. He's a 16 or he's 18. And for some reason, this imagery makes everybody look a little older.
Wow, that is just magnificent. Now, nothing will change by the longer you leave it in the fixture.
No.
That was all made by the exposure time.
Actually, if you leave it in longer, it may degrade to some, if you leave it in minutes and minutes and minutes.
Mm-hmm.
But there's our image.
And you compare that to the unidentified gentleman we have out of Dale's collection, and there's a connection to history.
It's a connection. The cool thing about tintypes is the piece you're holding in your hand as a collector or as a descendant is the exact same piece of metal that was in the camera in the studio with that person. So unless we figure out time travel, this is as close as we'll ever get to the real person that stood and posed for that photograph.
So which other photographic processes are like that?
Today, not many.
But even back then, the CDV is going to be a replication.
It's a replication. You have generations and generations of copies made. Even if it's of Lincoln, you can make many, many copies. This, there's one. There's no negative that came with this. So if you wanted a copy, you'd have to shoot another in-house, in-person print.
Fantastic. So
cool.
In order to give this to a customer or me in the era, what happens? Do I just take this with me right now?
I need to wash this fixer off, and I just dip it in another clear water bath, and it stays in there for about 5 minutes to 30 minutes or whatever. After that, I could just present it to you once it's dry. However, This surface that we're looking at here is the emulsion. Right now, if I took my finger and just drug it across, it would wipe right off because it's not engraved or burned into the plate at all. It's just writing on that thin film of emulsion.
So how do we protect it then?
Well, there was luckily a varnish that all these photographers used. It's gum sandarac, which is a tree sap that's put in with alcohol. I use Everclear, and lavender oil, which is like gives it elasticity, I should say, and so it smells like heaven, just kind of like the ether does. Anyway, and that will ride over that, and once it dries, it protects that image. These are very archivally precise. So with that varnish, as long as it's dried, this should last you your lifetime and the lifetime of several generations, as we know.
As people are buying originals today.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, I'm excited to add this to my collection, and what an experience. I've had my wet plate image made in the field, but now to be in a studio made within a few years of the Civil War in the same technology of the Civil War. Geez, Dave, thanks for sharing this. If somebody's interested in this, is this something that's accessible?
Absolutely. And here at the H.H. Bennett Studio, we make appointments just like they would have in the early days. You can't usually just walk in off the street, but we don't have costumes. You're not required to dress up like you were in the Civil War. Sometimes it's fun, but if you just want to come in and get the experience in your modern day life, we're happy to do that as well.
In your modern day life, how long are you here?
If you do one image, like this one today, almost an hour, to go through all the processes and explanation of what we're doing and everything like that.
Well, you talk about a connection to history. Folks, this is a way to come into a place like this that's 140 plus years old, walk out with a piece of tin that was in the camera when you were here that can be with your descendants in the future. Find a way, find a connection, enjoy the time, and we'll see you again on Civil War Digital Digest.